Thank you for inviting me to this webinar today. Great to be here. I presented at IISRM before, and a great opportunity for me to talk about some of the latest work that we've been doing. A report that I'm going to be talking about today was commissioned by the National Preparedness Commission, and Cranfield University did the piece of work in partnership with Deloitte. What I put on the screen there is top right hand side a QR code for that report, and screen's gone funny, sorry. So there's a QR code for that report which you can download from the Cranfield University website, and I've also put on the bottom left hand side, sorry, a link to my LinkedIn profile. I publish quite a lot of work on resilience in LinkedIn, and there's lots of posts, lots of reports, lots of kind of links to other information that you might find useful. So please do feel free to connect with me there. I'll put that back up at the end of the session. Just a little bit about me. So as was mentioned, I'm professor within the School of Management at Cranfield, but I also run what we call a grand challenge on resilience. A grand challenge being something that we think is of real interest and importance to society. And I think resilience, with all of the things that are going on in the world, all of the changes we've had, all of the disruptions, is such a significant aspect of business, of government policy, and it really requires us to look at resilience from multiple different perspectives. So we pulled together a grand challenge that connects all of Cranfield University, all of our schools. So we've got everything from people working on financial resilience to supply chain resilience to cybersecurity and resilience and counter-terrorism and resilience, ecological resilience, and so on. And that's been incredibly powerful in terms of really thinking about resilience from a more holistic and interdisciplinary perspective. So that's kind of what I do at Cranfield. And as I said, I spend a lot of my time also working with organisations and with government departments. And this piece of work that I'm going to talk about today was conducted a few months ago, relatively recent report. And in it, we spoke to over 50 senior leaders in organisations. And these were people that were responsible for the organisation, so chief executives, or were people who were responsible for risk and resilience inside those organisations. And it was a cross-sector group of organisations, and that's typical of my work. I tend to work across all sectors, from everything from retail organisations through to the banking sector, through to the nuclear industry. And I'm going to say a little bit about that in a second, and some of the similarities. But this piece of work, we spoke to about over 50 people that responded to this, and really looking at, so what were some of the practices, some of the practical things that they were doing that were enhancing resilience. And we pulled out 5 key things, which I'll talk about today, which seem to be very different to what most other organisations were doing. And they kind of differentiated them in terms of their approach to resilience. So that's kind of what I'll go through today. And as was mentioned, if you've got any questions, please put them into the question function on here, and I'll address the questions at the end of the session. So I said I worked across all kinds of different sectors on this. I've been working in this whole field for about 20 years now. And as I mentioned, everything from kind of nuclear industry to hospitals. And what I typically see is actually there's so many similarities across sectors. I think every sector thinks it's unique, and every sector thinks it's got a unique set of challenges, but actually a lot of the approaches that we take, a lot of the risks that we face, a lot of the challenges that organizations have in becoming more resilient are actually shared across all sectors. To the extent that when I work with organizations now, I kind of typically get deja vu, because a lot of the issues and challenges and conversations are just so familiar. so sort of repeating of some of those issues. What all of those organizations across all of those sectors typically will tell me is that we've actually made a lot of improvements over the last kind of couple of decades around risk and resilience. And so what I think we have made a lot of improvements on are that we've got much better regulation now. We're more regulated than we've ever been. We've got better governance in most organizations, most sectors. We've got committees, we've got escalation procedures, we've got that oversight function in organizations. We've got much better at risk management and actually looking at probability and consequence of certain risks. And we've got better at that, and we've got risk registers, and every executive team looks at their risks on a periodic basis and they tie that to their corporate strategy. And we've got better at measuring and monitoring stuff. So we've got KPIs and dashboards. And most organizations say, well, we've also got better at procedures and we've got better at compliance. We've got standard operating procedures and we've got compliance, we've got training for compliance. And we've got pretty good in terms of business continuity planning and kind of disaster recovery planning as well. And we audit, we investigate problems, and we've got dedicated teams that do this stuff. And actually a lot of teams say that they're pretty good at kind of firefighting, and that's when they kind of pull together and they come together and address a lot of the issues. And you kind of think, well, okay, so we've made a lot of advances, we've made a lot of improvements, and lots of organizations have done this across every sector, you know, in slightly different ways, but we have made massive improvements in all of these areas. And then you kind of say, okay, so what's the problem then if we've done all of this really good work? And then of course the real problem is that we still have surprising events. And I use the word surprising here really pointedly, because to everyone inside an organization, particularly to the executive teams, to senior leader teams, boards, events like the ones on the screen are always surprising. And we kind of go, well, we could never have seen that coming. We could never have picked up on these issues. We could have never looked at this in terms of saying it was, you know, potential at all. You know, we've got that kind of failure of imagination that these things can happen. But when we actually look at it and we look back and we say, well, hold on, these things didn't just happen. They weren't just one thing going wrong. They were actually made up of multiple things over a very long incubation period, where lots of things went wrong for this to happen. And we start to look at that and we start to say, well, it isn't just about kind of systems and processes. It's also about behavior and culture inside organizations, inside government. And it's kind of this slow drift into failure that we're actually really struggle with. And all of those things I put on the previous slide kind of tend to work for certain types of problems, but the more complex the problem and these kind of more incremental problems, the slow uncoupling problems, it doesn't tend to work so well. And all of these on the screen are kind of iconic examples and across, you know, multiple industries. And I literally could put up on this screen, you know, dozens of other examples. You know, literally in the past sort of 10 years or so, even pre-COVID, I could have been changing this slide every week, every month, because of the amount of disruptive events that we have. And all of these have had a massive impact, and they've had a massive impact in terms of the human impact, the social impact, the environmental impact, financial impact, operational impact. So across kind of 5 aspects of impact that I tend to look at. And these have been the big iconic ones, but then there's a whole range of other kind of disaster, crisis, disruptive events that happen beyond the public gaze in organizations of all types that might not even make it onto the front page of the newspapers, but these ones have, and they're all surprising. And I kind of like a bit tongue-in-cheek here saying, well, you know, people are talking about the new normal as being a period of uncertainty and disruption and ambiguity and that kind of VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment. Well, actually, like, let's get real, the old normal actually was a period of disruption and uncertainty, and we had plenty of these disaster crisis events. So I actually prefer to think about it as, moving into the never normal. I don't really understand what a normal might be, and I don't think that we'll ever reach a kind of normal state. I think everything's unfolding, everything's uncertain, and certainly we're going to have more disruptive events into the future. So this is what I see in typically in a lot of organizations, and I think, a picture says 1,000 words here. What you will often see is kind of leaders in an organization looking back at past success. So we're looking back upstream. We've got our sunglasses on, we've got a pair of noise cancelling headphones on, where people in the organization might be telling us that things are wrong, that there are issues, that there could be problems ahead, but we're kind of rowing happily downstream on a nice sunny day, and there's a bloody great big waterfall behind. And it's kind of this slow, blind drift into failure that seems to cause us problems in organizations. And it's often things that are caused by multiple small things going wrong that wouldn't even show up on a risk register. It's just that they all line up in that kind of James Reason Swiss cheese model, and on a bad day it happens. But it's the slow and steady uncoupling of organizations from its kind of processes. And in the sports sector, where you've got people like Sir Dave Brailsford, who did such great things with Team Sky, and used to talk about the aggregation of marginal gains, which is the concept kind of management speak, is that rather than asking an organization to do things 100% better, is that we do all the small things 1% better. And therefore we make 100% improvement because we do 101% improvements. Well, what you see in a lot of these failure events is the aggregation of marginal failures. It's the 100 small things that go wrong that combine, and it ends up in a major disruptive event. Now, if you look at this and you say, okay, so what is the problem? And I keep kind of going back to what's the problem we're trying to solve here. What I hear from a lot of organizations is 4 typical responses to this at the moment. When we say, okay, so you've got these disruptive events, and they'll say, well, some organizations will say, we are different. And so they distance themselves. It wouldn't happen here. We've got different processes. We've got different people. We've got systems in place to deal with those kinds of, just wouldn't happen here. We are different. You hear other organizations or other commentators on this who will say, well, these events are black swans. And in Taleb's book and his definition, a black swan is an event that's so low probability that no one would really imagine it happening and no one would prepare for it. And you say, well, are these things all black swans? And I think that's just a complete misconception here. And kind of the proof of that would be that the top right graph there is the National Risk Register, the UK's National Risk Register. And you'll see that pandemic, flu and influenza is the highest probability and the highest impact event that was picked up on that risk register as having consequence and probability for the UK. So you can see way up top right, high probability, high consequence. So it's not a black swan because we actually said it's highly probable and it's going to have a big impact. It's on our National Risk Register, which was published in 2008 and 2017, updated, and pandemic influenza hasn't moved. It was up top right-hand box. So these are not black swans. So I'm crossing out the first 2. And then you've got to say, well, actually then, okay, so is it that we are doing the right things, but we just need to do more of them? So all of that stuff I put on the slide before about regulation and risk management and governance, it's like those are the right things to do, but we just need to do more of them, or we need to do those things better. That might be a solution. Or is it that actually we need to do some different things? And I actually think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of 3 and also a bit of 4. I think it is that we need to do some of those things better, but I actually think we also need to be thinking in a different way. And it's not that I would say that we need to reject or get rid of any of those things that I put up on that earlier slide. It's that we need to build on them. It's not a kind of do something else, but it's actually a build. It's a both and argument that I'm going to make here. And I want to just be really clear about that. So I'm often asked, what is resilience? And I think there are so many different perspectives on resilience. And people will say, what's resilience compared to risk management or business continuity and all of these things? I think resilience is a much broader concept, and it has multiple components to it. So the most obvious definition sort of starts in a kind of engineering view that resilience is about robustness, and it's about an ability of a system to resist failure. So it's robust. And it's the persistence of the function of that system that you define, whether it's the robustness of an ecological system or the robustness of a technological system or robustness of a social system, and its ability to resist disruption. Okay, so it's kind of like its ability to absorb and stop it being disrupted. But we also see that there's kind of also a common view of resilience as in more like so not something like a hard block, like a brick, robust, that stops a disruption, but actually what about more like an elastic band? So it's that kind of bounce back, it's that adaptive, its ability to absorb, and we often call that kind of buffering capacity or absorptive capacity of the organization. So it can absorb and bounce back. And that's kind of response or recovery mode. So one, we can be robust. The second is that we can be more responsive and we can recover better. And both of those are kind of a defensive aspect of resilience. So both of those are in response to bad stuff happening. And either we're going to create robust systems or we're going to create more flexible systems that are able to respond very quickly to those types of issues. But there's also an upside side of resilience. And I think this is where it does move away from kind of business continuity and risk management to say, actually, it's not just about surviving in adversity, but we also need to thrive in adversity. So people have talked about things like anti-fragility and so on, which is very much about this kind of positive side, progressive side. And if we think about that, then there can be two ways to do that. You know, is that progressive side, that improvement, that thriving, is it actually about incremental movement and improvement and progression? So actually for an organization, it's the same systems, the same process, the same market, the same technology, but we just get better and better at doing it. And that makes us more resilient in the longer term. Or is it that we need to do something more transformational? We've got to adapt, we've got to innovate. And it's kind of these radical and fundamental shifts to the culture, to the structure, to technology. And this is the progressive side aspect of resilience. And for me, resilience is all four of these things, and they play out all of the time in organizations. So you'll see all the time that organizations will try to be resilient by building consistency into their organization. And that's the left-hand side of this model. So what you'll see is you'll have standard operating procedures for everything. There's compliance training because we want a consistent set of behaviors. We have a consistent set of goals in organizations. We have a consistent set of targets, a consistent set of KPIs, a consistent set of processes. And that's the left-hand side. So this is the view that kind of consistency builds resilience. And of course, the right-hand side is actually saying that it's not, it's flexibility that builds resilience. So it's actually either bottom right, it's flexible response, or top right, it's flexible progression. And that transformational adaptation, doing something very new, innovation, creativity. And of course, all four are very plausible strategies for being resilient as an organization, but there's an inherent set of tensions in all of these. So it, for example, bottom left-hand side, bottom left box is requires you to control risk. It's about managing risk, controlling risk. Top right box is actually about taking risk in order to transform and innovate. There's a clear tension. So do you say to your team members, Monday morning, I want you to be managing risk, mitigating risk, controlling risk. Tuesday morning, I want you to be a creative innovator. You know, those are fundamentally different aspects of an organization, fundamentally different mindsets, fundamentally different cultures. Again, responsive mode, bottom right, is very much about having people who are empowered to act, that can notice the problems, a culture that enables them to have the psychological safety in order to respond to problems. Top right box is generally about driving for efficiencies. Now, those two are at odds, because the efficiency move means that what we tend to do is drive out any slack in the organization, any redundancy in the organization, removal of waste. But actually, we need some of that slack, some of that redundancy, in order to enable people to have the space to notice the problems and the empowerment to do so. So all of these things end up with some core tensions, which I'll talk about as I go through. But that's kind of the core element of kind of my perspective on this, that resilience is about the management of the tensions. And where you sit in terms of the 4 quadrants isn't that you say an organization sits in any one of those sections. What it says is there's probably an appropriate balance across all of those things that's fit for purpose for your organization. And if you don't get that right, then there's a failure mode in each one of those. So either you become too brittle, or you become too fragmented, and so on. And if we get that right, what we should be able to do in terms of resilience is this definition, is we should be able, and it is an ability here, resilience is an ability of an organization to anticipate future events, prepare for them, respond and adapt. And it's that piece about, it's actually also this incremental change as well as the sudden disruptions. So whilst we might be able to respond very quickly to a cyber attack, what about the slower burning incremental changes, like the impact of climate change, the impact of aging populations and so on, that are going to impact us in the future? So it's not just about existing risks and managing them now with maybe the bottom left-hand box, but actually we also need to be thinking about the future changes with probably the top right-hand box. So what do we also see in these organizations that are resilient when we spoke to them? So the kind of 5 key questions that I've grouped these things under, and then kind of 5 key shifts. And I'm going to just go through these very briefly. And again, if you've got questions, then we can pick those up at the end. But 5 key questions, and I think one of the things that I've seen a lot in the last kind of 20 years is a gradual shift away from seeing risk and resilience as a technical aspect of an organization run by technical kind of people, to something that's actually more of a senior leadership and a more executive board level agenda. And you know, if a senior leadership team's not thinking about the resilience of the organization for the future, or the resilience of its strategic initiatives, then, you know, given the disruptions that we've had, you know, what is the agenda of the board? I think the resilience agenda, you know, is absolutely a board level thing. So these are some of the things that these organizations were doing differently. So the first one is, you know, what are we or should we be concerned about? And what we saw in these organizations that were really thinking differently about resilience is that they weren't just looking at existing risks, they were also looking at future trends, and then combining those 2 things to say, so what might be the emergent risks of the future? And, you know, I give a very practical example of that. So if you've got an existing risk, which is that you've got elderly people that in the winter have really poor mobility and therefore can't access the healthcare that they might require, you've got an existing risk of power outages that we've seen in the last few months in terms of high winds that's knocking out our power grid. And then you've got a future trend of people moving towards EV cars, so electronic cars. And we know that we've got climate change that's going to increase the number of extreme weather events. So you've got trend of moving towards EV cars and a trend towards increasing climate change and the potential for a disruptive event. And if you combine those 2 things, it will mean that in 10 years from now, more elderly people will be driving electric cars. We're going to have more power outages. Therefore, you're going to end up with even more people that are isolated at home unable to move because they haven't got the electricity to charge the cars. So you can start to see that actually, you know, we've got to start looking longer term across different time horizons here, and actually looking at trends and the existing risks. And the way that we also do this is look at this from the perspective of those 5 capitals that I talked about. So what's the potential human impact? What's the social impact in terms of reputation? What's the environmental impact? What's the operational impact and the built environment and our critical infrastructure? And then what's the financial impact? And what these organizations do is they really do start to look at the 3 time horizons, and they're starting to look at this much more holistically, at looking at the interdependencies between those 5 capitals. So that was definitely one of the things that we see in these organizations that differentiates those that are thinking differently about resilience. The second one that is very different is that, you know, what is it that we want to be resilient? And we see in these organizations that are thinking differently about resilience is that they are shifting away from thinking about the resilience of assets and the recoverability of assets, or the resilience of their processes. So number 2 or number 3 here, and they're looking at the resilience of the outcomes that their organization needs to deliver to their key stakeholders or their end users. So here, you know, the end user wants the whole. But what we've typically done is look at building the resilience into building a more resilient drill, or we look at the recoverability of the drill or the process. So in kind of take a water example, you know, people want drinkable water, but often our resilience policies and practices are focused on the treatment plant and our pipe network and how quickly we get that up and running again, not necessarily on what are the alternatives and options we have in terms of ensuring that those people get drinkable water. And that shift to focusing on what are the essential outcomes that our end users and our key stakeholders need us to deliver this time, next time, every time, even in a disaster, even in a crisis, is really shaping people's thinking. Because you think about your own organizations, within the first couple of months of COVID hitting, or within the first few weeks, organizations were making decisions about what is essential to us. What do our end users need us to deliver? What can we actually drop now? Where do we move resource from and to in order to ensure that we're continuing to deliver those outcomes? The key thing here is these resilience organizations are making those choices and having that conversation before the crisis. You don't want to be having that prioritization conversation in the crisis. So really understanding what the essential outcomes are, crucial. Our experience of this, having done quite a bit of work on this now over the last few months, is that it's actually quite hard to get senior leadership teams to agree on what their essential outcomes are, because they've never really had that conversation. So it might be something we pick up on in questions. Right, the third one is, well, once you've actually really understand the essential outcome, then we can start to define impact thresholds. So I'll give you a little example of this. So an essential outcome for a bank is the ability for you to make a credit card payment to buy stuff, okay? So that's an essential outcome. You're the end user now, and you go into a shop today and you try and buy something and it doesn't work. And the person behind you, their card doesn't work because they've got the same bank card as you. And then we realize that anyone that shops at that, uses that bank can't make a payment. What's the impact threshold? When does it move from being an inconvenience to being an intolerable impact across our 5 capitals? So if you think about this, you know, you'd probably be pretty pissed off initially. 10 minutes in, you're going to be fairly angry. 15 minutes in, people are on social media and you're getting adverse social media hits about the bank. Probably an hour in, and we've seen this very recently, how public attitudes change so rapidly. There'll be cars queuing up down the streets because people don't think they'll be able to get fuel. There won't be any toilet rolls on the shelves. And you know, we can often have an adverse public reaction that escalates very quickly. So actually, what is the impact thresholds? What's a tolerable limit on that essential outcome? And again, not many organizations can tell me what their essential outcomes are and what their tolerable impact levels are across human impact, social impact, operational, financial, and environmental, as I said. So once we've got those kind of impact thresholds measured and decided, you can then actually look at the end-to-end delivery of that essential outcome, map it from end to end, surface to core, and say how resilient is the system at the moment. What you'll find is that a lot of those essential outcomes cut across organizational silos and might actually cut across organizational boundaries, because to deliver them, we need multiple organizations. And that's, of course, where all the problems lie, because it's the interfaces between organizations and systems, and it's the areas where there's poor communication or we end up with single points of failure of critical individuals or critical bits of kit being in this system that are essential, but actually until we map it, we don't realize that we've got that vulnerability in the system. And of course, what you can do then, once you've mapped end-to-end delivery, is start to stress test the system. And okay, not many organizations do stress testing. Financial services do it in terms of financial resilience and just about starting to on operational resilience. But do we genuinely stress test the systems? And what we tend to do to stress test the system in kind of the old paradigm is that we'll run the kind of hurricane scenario or the flood scenario or the terrorist incident scenario and get our senior teams around and say, right, today we're going to pretend that a hurricane's happened. How resilient are we? These organizations don't do that. And one of them, really big technology, international technology giant, said to us the biggest shift that they made in terms of their resilience was when they stopped playing hurricanes. And what he meant by that is that you get people in the room to do the hurricane scenario, half of them switch off and go, it will never happen. The other half say, we've got a system to deal with this anyway. And no one's engaged. So what they do is stress test around a whole set of business assumptions. So they've got their essential outcomes, they've got their impact thresholds, they've got the map, they've got the blueprint of how they deliver that, and then they tweak it and ramp up the impact and the disruption to it. So what if we don't have, we can't have access to those buildings or that bit of infrastructure? Or what if 20% of our staff can't come to work? Can we deliver those? Can we stay within our impact thresholds? Can we deliver the essential outcome? What if 30% of people can't come to work? I mean, that kind of thinking, if we'd have done that before COVID, would have been so impactful for organizations, because we would have stress tested our ability to deal with those kind of incidents. So what this does is it starts shifting away from kind of risk, looking at our resilience in terms of material risk types, and it gets us to think in a risk agnostic way about how resilient our systems are, regardless of the risk. It doesn't matter if it's a flood, a terrorist incident, a power outage. Can we deliver our essential outcomes? We've already stress tested the system to do that. And that's a very different way of thinking, rather than saying, what's the probability and consequence? And then let's have a conversation about our risk appetite. If you can say, under a certain set of extreme but plausible scenarios, we cannot stay within our impact thresholds, we cannot deliver our essential outcomes, then that is a far better basis in which to make investment decisions than a kind of very loose what's our risk appetite. So that was the third thing. The fourth thing was back to my model, which is this model of 4 quadrants and 4 tensions. And what you see left-hand side is that a lot of organizations, when they think about resilience or when something bad happens, they tend to go bottom left-hand, put more preventative controls in, more monitoring, more compliance. But what we know is that in a crisis, you actually need agility, you need flexibility, you need that mindful response. We also know that we need this progressive side. The only way out of a crisis is usually an innovation strategy. We need to find new ways, learn new ways to do things, The only way we're going to deal with big future events like climate change is through adaptive innovation. But most organizations, their resilience policy are on the left-hand side and usually bottom left-hand side. And you can see a couple of like little diagrams, the pink ones in the middle. We're doing a lot of mapping at the moment, working with organizations to say, okay, so where are you? In terms of your design, are you designed for consistency or flexibility? And the culture of the organization, is it progressive? Is it defensive? So where are you now? Where do you need to be to deal with challenges 3 years from now, 10 years from now? What's the direction of travel? What do we actually need to change in terms of the organizational culture here? And the right-hand side just says that this is really the leadership challenge. It's about managing those tensions. How do you assure compliance while also innovating? How do you increase efficiencies and drive for productivity while also having the flexibility in order to be able to make local decisions and empower people and have that level of flexibility? And for me, it is like that tug of war. And what we tend to do in a lot of organizations is when something bad goes wrong, or we're all feeling a bit anxious about the uncertainty of the environment, we take the resources from the right-hand side, like moving some of the people in that tug of war, and we put them on the left. And what tends to happen then is the whole tug of war moves towards the bottom left until it all falls over, and we've driven out all of that adaptive capability in the organization. And for me, that is why this kind of resilience tensions thinking is absolutely crucial, because the way that we structure and organize is often going to impede our ability to be adaptive in the future. And then the final one, and this is my last slide, and then I'll go to some questions, is that, like, how do you change? And again, we see some differences in organizations. A lot of organizations, their whole resilience agenda is that they've got a lot of the good things going on, a lot of the things that I've talked about happening, but in pockets in the organization. And that's the top, that's that left-hand side. They've got lots of people doing these kind of heroic endeavors of managing bits of that agenda that I've just talked about, but it's not in any way kind of collaborative or coordinated. So you've got your risk management people working over here, you've got business continuity over here, you might have your cyber team over here, you've got information security team over here, then you've got sustainability or ED&I, and you've got people working on adaptation and innovation for the future, but they never talk to one another. And it's not in any way collaborative. And then you start, so the next level up is you start to see some organizations that what they'll do is they'll go, right, what we need to manage this agenda is we need to bring people from across the organization into kind of multidisciplinary teams. And then they say, okay, now solve the organizational problem. And those people aren't authorized to act. There's no real sense of what they're trying to achieve. There's no direction, there's no alignment, there's no commitment of those people. They kind of come together, talk, it becomes a talking shop, and nothing really happens. And then you see some organizations that are actually moving towards and implementing a much more coordinated resilience strategy and using resilience as an umbrella for all of those things. And having that broad definition, which is that we're going to have a shed load of disruptive events in the future. Let's look at that in a more risk agnostic way. Let's really ask ourselves, how resilient is the organization? For every strategic initiative that we have, let's ask the question, how resilient is that? Let's look at our essential outcomes. Let's have some shared understanding of what's important to the organization. Let's have a sensible conversation about impact thresholds. Let's look at tolerable levels and what we actually believe in. Let's map it, and then let's stress test our system. And that might all be quite uncomfortable, but actually it's the right way to go if we're going to actually be more resilient in the future. And what we see, you know, often people will say, like, where's your start point for this? That sounds like it's massive. But actually, if you take that essential outcome perspective on this, what we've been doing with some organizations is just taking one or two essential outcomes and then talking about what are they, let's get shared understanding, let's map them, let's talk about impact thresholds, let's not do the whole organization, let's do proof of concept, and let's build it up from a small number of those essential outcomes and looking at the resilience of the delivery of those, and then we build it up to the organization. And that's much more of that kind of bottom piece about a coordinated endeavor, and kind of scaling up and also building internal capability. Because what we can't do in organizations is see the risk and resilience as either sitting in the old view, being kind of the accountability and owned by a risk department, or it's owned by the senior leadership team. It has to be socially distributed across the organization, and something that we do just as good day-to-day management practice. So I think that's where I was going to get to, and very happy to take on some questions. I did say I was going to put my LinkedIn code up there, and I'm very happy. Please do connect to me afterwards, give me any comments or thoughts, and if you want any further information, there's plenty there. So back to you, Sue.
Oh, thank you, David, for a really interesting and informative session. We do have some questions. The first one is, in terms of questions, what sort of questions should we be asking ourselves to go about identifying our essential outcomes and impact thresholds?
Yeah, now that is really good, and the question, I'd broaden that to who should be making the choices about what's essential. And I'll give you a real example, a real example, and I know I'm being recorded, so I'm going to have to be really careful here because I'm going to talk about Cranfield. So I'll give you a real example about how we can make a mistake here. So I've asked this question at Cranfield, and we've got a few internal pilots doing some of this resilience work here. So, because I always think you know, as an organization, you need to walk the talk yourself. First conversation we had about what are the essential outcomes for Cranfield, and you ask executive team, they'll go straight to corporate strategy, and they'll go straight to their key metrics. If you ask a member of faculty, what are the essential outcomes, they'll tell you it's about the learning experience on the course of their students, because obviously Cranfield teaches MSc students and executive students. So they'll talk about the experience and how good my program is. You ask the students, what are the essential outcomes? I want a qualification and I want a job at the end of it. I want the job that I want. Now, if you start to look at that, then the qualification is just about the delivery and ensuring that they pass. But the careers one is an interesting one, because the impact on that individual, if we don't deliver against that essential outcome, is really quite profound. It's going to have an impact on them. It could have a reputational impact on us. But what resources do we put in place in terms of looking at the delivery of that essential outcome? What are our impact thresholds around that? You know, what's an acceptable level? At what point do we say, well, that's an unacceptable level? Is it that we have a certain percentage after 6 months that are not in the jobs that they want? Is it after 3 years? What percentage is that? And you can start to then say, well, hold on, we're looking at that now from the stakeholders' perspective, and we're mapping back from that. So I don't necessarily think it's the executive teams. I think it is really starting with conversations with the stakeholders, listening to the voices. And I always say to people, like, a start point for this also is what keeps you up at night? What's the biggest concerns that you have? And then let's take that area as an area that we start to look at in terms of resilience.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what's resilience in the context of the organisation, i.e. employers, supporting people or human asset risks, and what approach should HR and risk management leaders take?
Yeah, I mean, there could be multiple different questions in that question. I think the people element of resilience is absolutely essential, and the way that I've been trying to explain this is that we see this kind of 5 capitals approach as both an input and also a potential impact. So your kind of human capital, your skills, knowledge and ability is so central to our ability to be resilient. But equally, there's also an impact around what the organization does on people and that human capital. And a great example of that would have been with COVID, because one of the unintended consequences of people working at home is the increase in mental health and so on. And I think a lot of organizations will make a lot of their choices, usually around risk and resilience. It has been traditionally driven by reputational risk. It's been driven by financial kind of reputational impact and financial impact and operational impact, and probably the human impact and the environmental impact of the organization has probably had less precedence in the organization, or less emphasis. But I think we're starting to really challenge that now. I think the whole ED&I agenda, again, both an input and an output, because unless we've got diversity in organizations, we don't pick up on the weak signals of problems. And the diversity of voices, the diversity of perspectives, diversity of thought in organizations is absolutely central to resilience. But equally, if organizations aren't really tackling things like ED&I and employability and what makes organizations a good employer, then actually they don't retain or recruit enough good people, and then that's going to have an impact on the resilience of the organization. So I think the kind of human capital element absolutely central to this.
And really following up on that is, how do you actually encourage individuals within an organization to become more sort of individually resilient?
Yeah, that's a good one, because I think that what I've been saying here is that organizational level resilience for me is kind of this kind of strategic and is about strategy and culture of the organization. It's not the sum of individual resilience gives you organizational resilience, but clearly we want also in our organizations to have resilient people. I think kind of linking the two things together, I think one of the things that we saw with COVID is a lot of organizations said to us, we've really focused on informing people, and we've kind of over-informed and communicated to people. Informing and involving are two very different things, and I think a lot of people have felt like they haven't actually been involved in a lot of the changes. It's kind of been done to them, and I think that has an impact on our own individual resilience. The other thing that I touched on earlier that I think is really central to this is creating psychological safety in organizations. Because unless people feel psychologically safe, the whole right-hand side of that model doesn't work, either the defensive or progressive, because people don't feel able to have the safety in order to take up their authority and deal with issues locally. They're always trying to escalate the problem, and they won't want to do the trial because they're worried about the error that might come from that trial and what will happen to them if they kind of try and innovate and take a risk and it doesn't work. And that psychological safety, I think, is absolutely crucial to this this whole resilience agenda. And that kind of links into other things like, the psychological safety for people to speak up about their concerns and the problems and what they foresee in the future. And unless leaders are listening to those voices, and potentially that becomes really difficult because they're often seen as voices of dissent, and people naysayers and people raising the bad news when we ought to be talking about the good stuff. But unless we actually embrace that and create an environment where people can speak up, we are going to be more rowing backwards, not listening to those voices and going over the waterfall.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, we're aware of our risk management, we're aware of our business continuity, so aren't we doing all this already?
Yeah, that's a great one. I hear that quite a bit. And I think the things that I would pull out a couple of real differences, I think. One, I think a lot of risk management business continuity is in the bottom half of that diagram. It is still very much a defensive agenda. It doesn't really speak to that progressive agenda. I think that the other aspect is this notion of actually the delivery of essential outcomes and impact thresholds, and that notion of actually building resilience into the outcome. I think a lot of business continuity, a lot of risk management, or especially business continuity, is about recoverability of the asset or the process, and less about actually exploring what are the options and alternatives that we have in terms of the essential outcome and that kind of more stakeholder perspective. And I think also what that does is it takes us into a more creative, innovative way of looking at this and saying, you know, it's not just about controlling risks, it's actually having imagination and creativity and innovation to move forward and to deal with some of those longer term challenges. And like I said, I think innovation is our only exit strategy from any crisis or any challenge. And a lot of the challenges that we have, whether they're technological, social, geopolitical at the moment, environmental, we don't have the answer to. You know, there aren't very clear outcomes about what we're going to do. They're wicked problems. There's no kind of answer that's already out there. We can't take an off-the-shelf solution to any of those. It's all got to be about innovation and learning our way towards some solutions. And for me, that is part of the resilience, because if we don't do that, we're not resilient in the longer term. And I just don't think that's part of the agenda on kind of risk management or business continuity.
Thank you. I'll just see if we've got any more questions. Give people a couple more minutes to ask anything if they'd like to. Don't forget, just put any questions you've got in the question box. No, I think that's all the questions we're going to get today. So thank you again, David, for sharing your knowledge with us. Oh, there is one just come in. What is your advice on the challenges related to the understanding that resilience is limited to the strategic?
Can you repeat that one?
Yeah. What is your advice on the challenges related to the understanding that resilience is limited to the strategic level?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I see. Okay, so this might be. I see resilience as kind of a nested concept. So you can imagine like an onion ring moving out. The resilience you can think about as the resilience of, like we just talked about, individual resilience. You can then take the concept out and say, well, what about team level or group level resilience? You can talk about it in terms of your department, your division. It's exactly the same concept in terms of, you know, how resilient are the outcomes you're trying to achieve. You can take it to an organizational strategic level. But I actually think that organizations, and I haven't said this yet, but I think it's a really important thing, is that one of the big differences we saw in some of these organizations was that they weren't just looking at their own individual resilience. They were asking the question, how do we contribute to the resilience of the whole sector or the whole system in which we're embedded? And that actually gets us to look outside the organization. So you can take this individual, team, division, department, organization, the whole of your supply chain, or the whole of the sector, or the system in which we're embedded. Now, the National Resilience Strategy, which will be coming out later this year, there was a consultation several months ago. It's not been published yet. Talks about the need for us to look at resilience from a whole of society perspective. And I think the key thing here is that I've mentioned earlier that a lot of the risks that we have, a lot of the challenges that we have are the interdependencies that we've got in our system. You just look at the moment with the Ukraine situation and how dependent we are on oil and gas, and how interdependent all of our systems are, and how difficult it is to uncouple those systems. Well, a lot of these risks actually tend to exploit the interdependencies in our system. So if we're only looking at resilience from inside our own silo, we're never going to be able to deal with those risks in the future. The only way we can deal with them is to look at it more collaboratively and actually look at it in a more holistic, whole of system way. So this question of, let's not just look about the resilience of my team, my department, my organization, but what is the contribution that I make to the resilience of the system, the sector, society? I think it's got to be the question moving forward. I don't think it's just strategic, it's nested like an onion rings.
Thank you ever so much. I think that is now the end of all the questions. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge with us today. It's been a really informative session. Thank you to everybody that's joined us as well. I'll put the recording onto the YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow, so you will be able to have a look in your own time and catch up. So thank you again, David. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.